everyone. My name is Mary Zaminsky. I'm one of Dr. Kim's 400 level students in her lab, and I did my capstone on campus climate researchers and their demographics. So to start off with, I'll just be going over like basic psych paper stuff. I'll be introducing the topic, I'll go over the methods I used, the results of my study, and then a discussion at the end. So to start off with, we have to talk about administrative power in order to understand the topic of campus climate researchers. So, administrative power, like we all know bias exists. Bias exists and it is part of our everyday society. But if bias is not unlearned, it affects the trainings that people get. And the trainings that people get then affect the institutions and make these institutions inherently biased. And continue that systemic discrimination. An example of this is seen in behavioral analyses, and for those of you that don't know behavioral analyses, diagnose children with behavioral problems in schools, and those diagnoses, if there is one at all, and the support given can differ based on biases like the race of the child. So for example, a white child could be met with much more support than a black child due to racism that a behavioral analysis may not have unlearned. How this relates to research culture in psychology, researchers inherently have administrative power. They get to decide what research is done on, as well as most of the time researchers are professors on college campuses, so they also have that other administrative power on the college campus as well. Moving forward into the research culture in psychology, psychology places itself as politically neutral. This is seen through weird samples, which are white, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic samples, which don't make up the global majority. It only makes up a small fraction of the population, but these are all seen as neutral and can be applied to everyone when they in fact cannot be. And scholars that challenge these notions, which are typically scholars of color, are met with pushback. The basis of my study can be seen in Hopp et al., who found that researchers do have a topic preference based on racial demographics. In the study, they found that there were NIH funding disparities because Black researchers were more likely to research human subject researchers. They tackled things like HIV, healthcare inequalities, community work, things that white researchers typically did not research, and these topics were also underfunded. How this all connects to campus climate research, and that campus climate is a very expansive and diverse topic. It inherently tackles bias on college campuses as it tries to create a more inclusive place for everybody, and if certain people are not being looked at, if mostly weird samples are being looked at, we cannot help everybody or understand the full extent to which a campus climate is without this. So I hypothesize that campus climate researchers will also have a preference of research topic based on race, and I will also extend this to gender and sexuality to expand on previous literature, and also researchers of color will be more likely to have diverse samples than white researchers. Getting into the methods, I feel like I have to start out with a statement on positionality. Research does not exist in a vacuum. Our identities affect who we are and why we choose to do things. So I am a white, trans, masked, queer, disabled person from a working class family. Because of these things, I have been interested in microaggressions and campus climate from the moment I walked into Dr. Kim's lab. And then my own negative experiences on campus what has continued to influence my research and what made me really fight for and want to tackle this capstone. So take that as you will as I go over the results, and keep that in mind throughout the rest of the study. So my participants, they had to publish at least one campus climate article. All of these articles were found in PsycInfo. All the articles have to be from the US and have reliable contact information, and in total I had 82 participants. And a survey was sent out to participants that asked questions to identify their race, gender, sexuality, and other salient identities. All of these questions were open-ended and optional in order to create a more positive research experience instead of forcing researchers to put themselves into a category that they might not fully fit into. Continuing to collect article data, 233 articles were used, and I collected the identities studied, which yes, does include race, gender, and sexuality, but it also extends to other things like sexual assault status, religious affiliation, as well as socioeconomic status and other things like that. Then the primary race, gender, and sexuality of the sample was also taken, and what I mean by that is that the largest group from that demographic was what categorized the data. So for example, if there were 80 white participants and 20 participants of color, that research article will be labeled as mostly white. That's what the primary race would be labeled as. So all of the articles were categorized. I did not do any quantitative analyses in that section. For researcher data, I used all the authors listed. So if there were 6 authors, I tried to contact all 6 authors. Everybody was assigned an identification code in order to keep their identities anonymous from the data for protection purposes, and after IRB approval, emails were sent out with a survey link. Moving on to my results. This is the descriptive statistics of all campus climate articles that I found. So as you can tell, this is a very diverse and expansive field. These orange bars indicate the highest amount of campus climate articles. So the highest one covered people of color with 21% of the articles covering that topic, and this didn't cover specific racial identities, rather it lumps people of color together as a whole. The next highest one with 18.9% was victims of sexual misconduct and violence, so this included victims of sexual assault, misconduct, domestic violence. All of those were lumped together because they were all trying to tackle the same thing, so to speak. And then nearly 16% of the articles tackled multiple identities, so they had at least 2 of the identities seen here below, and these articles took a specifically intersectional approach. Moving on to the pink bars, that is the medium amount of articles that had about 10% of articles in them. This covers general campus climate, which just does an overview of campus climate and all the demographics there. They didn't take a specific intersectional sample, as well as LGBTQ and LGBTQ. So one sample included trans people in their look at queer identities, and one did not. The rest of them are under 6%, and they cover more specific identities like specific racial groups. Continuing on with descriptive statistics, out of all the samples, about 50% of the articles had majority white samples, and nearly a quarter of the articles did not take any racial demographic information at all. So although some of this is from the articles being reviewed, other times it's because they didn't feel like it was relevant towards their study. This was similarly found for gender, with women making up 50% of the gender sample, articles with the most gender groups. And as for sexuality, nearly 70% of the articles did not take any demographic information on sexuality. Like I said before, this is part of review, but some of them didn't feel like it was necessary to take this into account for their study, while other times when dealing with like sexual assault, you might not want to know the sexuality of that group, but some researchers did not take that. And then the next highest group of sexuality taken in samples was heterosexual. So as you can see, there's lots of privilege identities at play here. As for researcher demographics, nearly 80% of my sample was white, 50% identified as women, with nearly 25% identifying specifically as cisgender women, stating that privileged identity. So in total, about 75% of my sample identified as women in some sort of way, and nearly 70% identified as heterosexual. I used chi-square tests in order to look at, to see whether the demographics of the researchers corroborate with the identity studied, and everything was found to be significant, except the gender of the researcher was not found to predict the gender of the sample. It's also important to note that a majority of the cells during these tests had less than 5 participants. So this is an example of my SPSS output here. The highlighted portions are ones that had more than 5 participants in them. That's not to say that the rest of these things aren't important. More like we have to ask, why aren't white researchers researching these other topics? Or why aren't there more researchers of color in my sample? Continuing on to more notable statistics, so all of these had more than 5 participants in them. as you could see, white researchers largely did not research people of color, although some of the other identity study could take an intersectional approach, not all of them did. It was found that cisgender were more likely to study underprivileged identities, and that bisexuals were more likely to research victims of sexual misconduct and violence, which makes sense given that bisexuals, especially bisexual women, are more likely to face this problem than anyone else in the LGBTQ+ community. Out of all the articles that did not take demographic information, nearly 80% of them were done by white researchers, and out of all the articles that had mostly white samples, over 90% were also done by white researchers, and this was similarly found for straight researchers and straight samples. So, a discussion. So my first hypothesis was supported because it was found that researchers do have a topic preference based on race, and then this also expands the literature as it was also found to have a topic preference of gender and sexuality. However, it's hard to tell if my second hypothesis was supported or not because I didn't have a very diverse sample. However, it was found that white researchers are more likely to have white samples, so in that way it was sort of supported, and it also expands on the literature with this same findings being found for heterosexuals. So, to put this all into context, campus climate has largely ignored issues on race. LGBTQ and POC have historically been underrepresented in surveys. We'll get more onto why later. My sample was full of privileged identities. My sample and the samples that were studied in campus climate as a whole are weird samples. They don't cover most of the world's population. So this lack of diversity could be from preferences, like specifically in-group preferences, where people more likely want to interact with people of their same in-group. So although white researchers may not be entirely aware of it, they may have a preference for having mostly white samples because they find them easier to interact with. So this leads to POC being less likely to be recruited. And part of this could also be a lack of trust in researchers. It was specifically found in Latino communities that they don't trust researchers maintaining confidentiality, they fear discrimination, mostly based on language, and that there are cultural differences between the researchers and those that they study, which also contributes to the underrepresentation of LGBTQ and POC in surveys, as they might not ask completely representative questions. Also, there have been historic preventions for Black and brown people getting access to education, especially higher education. So this creates a lack of diverse sample of college students, but also a lack of diverse researchers due to these systemic inequalities. As for limitations, none of these are the fault of my own. This is just sadly the world that we live in. So given the second Trump administration, where you could be deported for being brown, whether you're Hispanic or not, where trans people are being erased from government websites, it makes sense that participants are scared to participate, especially those from more marginalized backgrounds. I also had a response bias where a lot of the researchers that did respond to my survey sent me an email wishing me luck. So this shows that they are very happy to participate in the survey. Also, because I had to delete all identifying information in order to protect the safety of the researchers, I cannot send follow-up emails, and LinkedIn had a paywall, so if I had to contact people through LinkedIn, I had to wait to connect with them, and then not everybody wanted to connect because why would you want to connect with some undergrad that you don't know? Also, all of the researchers, I did not count how many, were on sabbatical, and these are the researchers that are currently doing research and are active in the field, so I missed out on a good population to study there. Like I said before, lack of diversity in research. So what do we do now that we know this? I think in the future, we need to uplift minority researchers, as these people are the change makers of the field. They look at underrepresented populations and want their voices to be heard. Also, this study should be replicated with the larger sample, specifically a more diverse sample, but also in other areas of psychology as well, like social psych, biopsych, IO-psych, to name a few, but also in completely different fields such as engineering, healthcare, and English, to see who does what research and any biases that can be seen there. And in order to have more diverse samples, psychology needs to work on building trust with communities. It's not enough to just do the research. You have to build that relationship, reach out, see how to make these communities comfortable and how to support them, and like really get to know them. So Thank you so much. If you have any questions, you can email me there, and my paper will be done sometime during finals week, so if you would like it after I finish it, please contact me.